Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Invisible Innocence, and I am your host, Meghan Moret. Thanks so much for stopping back in for another awesome episode. You're going to love this one today. I have a guest that I am just so excited to talk to today. Her name is Meghan Connors, and she is a survivor advocate and also a trainer, an educator in this arena of human trafficking. She knows more about this field than I could ever dream of, and I'm just so honored to be able to finally sit down with you and talk to you face to face, and for you just to help us and help everyone just know a little bit more about this awful, horrific crime that that we're hearing so much more about, day by day. Now we're hearing all of these different celebrities' names that are getting brought up. We're hearing about, P. Diddy. You hear Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. You hear all, in everybody's innocent until proven guilty, but you just hear all of these different names now that are being connected to this. And I know that you love to train the people that are going to make the biggest difference. And those people are law enforcement, people in the medical field. And I just want, let's start there, and let's start with why you're so passionate about this, how you got to where you are today, and then we're just going to talk. I've got so many questions for you, and I know that you have so much that you want to share too. But let's start there. Let's start with how you got here and why you are so passionate about spending all of the time that you do and emotion into educating people.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I came into this work because originally I myself am a survivor of trafficking. I'm pretty open about that. And now I do the advocacy. I work with minors. I work with adults. I get to work with victims and survivors across the country, and to interact with law enforcement and to interact with healthcare and to train advocates on kind of meeting in the middle. Because what I experienced when I was both being trafficked and then when I was trying to leave my trafficking situation was that I didn't have the language or understanding that I was being trafficked, which we can talk about why that happens, but also that I continued to fall through gaps in systems over and over and over, that the people who probably went into their field because they wanted to help didn't actually know what trafficking looked like. And I didn't have the language to explain my situation. They didn't have the skill set to identify my situation. And then we just kind of clashed heads over and over and over. And I was really, really jaded for a while. I was really angry at law enforcement, at healthcare, at advocates. I felt like I had just been totally missed. And
they dropped the ball.
Absolutely. And then I realized, wait, they just don't know.
Yeah.
And I started to have conversations with different frontline workers and to talk about why I made certain decisions and why certain things happened, and to see other victims and survivors in their process. And in doing this work, we see a huge change. Right. I mean, every training, people come in saying, I don't know if I've seen trafficking, or, yeah, but they're just prostitutes or junkies, or they're choosing this, right? And then by the end of it, they're like, I saw it and I think I missed it. Or I might know somebody now. What do I do? Let's do something about it. And they really care.
And I love that you said that, because me, I'm not a survivor. I've fortunately never been in that situation, but I have a heart for victims of it. And so that's why I do what I do in this field. And because I just simply want to try and educate people, because just like you said, some victims don't even know that they're being trafficked. Many people don't know what trafficking is. And so I think it's really important to make sure that people know what it is, know what to look for, know what the vulnerabilities are, and then more than anything, talk about how we're never going to fix it, but how can we start to help the situation in our society, just in our country, like just in our country. How, what do we do? I mean, how do we keep moving forward in helping when people don't even know what it is that they're looking at or how to deal with it? You and I both know that we can't just sit down with someone that we suspect might be being trafficked and sit down and go, So you being trafficked? What happened? What happened last night when you were there? You know, that's just not how the conversation goes. And I think that's why this is so important for someone like you to be able to tell it from a lived experience, and to also and to share what you've learned, because now that you're out of that situation, you're still learning, but you're able to gather, you know, from other victims, from law enforcement. You're able to go in and see where the loopholes are, and hopefully, well, you are doing it, but you know, then you share with me, then I can share with others, with our audience, and we can kind of get the ball rolling. So, you know, I appreciate that very, very much.
Well, we have to have conversations like this, right? If we don't have these conversations, then where are we ever going to learn, right? It's that you know better, you do better. And I can learn from you just as much as you can learn from me, right? It is a team, and nobody is an expert in trafficking. Even as a survivor, when I interact with another victim or survivor of trafficking, they are the expert in their situation.
Yeah,
I might know
right.
a little bit more about the game or the life or all of that, but I don't know their situation. I'm not an expert in trafficking in everybody's situation. I'm becoming more an expert in my own human behavior, but all
Yes.
behavior makes sense. And I think that typically when we think about trafficking, we are reliant on the media because we don't have these conversations and the training very much. And so just as much as law enforcement, healthcare, the general community is looking for this white van is going to abduct me from a Target parking lot and now I'm going to be sold into trafficking, the victims are also seeing these media things and saying, so that's trafficking. So what's happening to me is not. Anything to exclude yourself from feeling vulnerable or in a narrative. And the reality is that that's not what trafficking looks like.
Right.
Most trafficking victims will not identify as a victim of trafficking while they're being trafficked. That is not because they are naive or they are just totally unaware and they need to be rescued and this whole thing, right?
Why is it?
It's because you cannot hold the reality and depravity of what's happening to you and survive it at the same time. Most victims of trafficking have some kind of relationship with their pimp or their trafficker, and they're not going to refer to them as their pimp or their trafficker usually, right? It might be their boyfriend or their uncle or their friend or whatever else, right? And I think that when we have to look at that, the situation that they're in, so they have been groomed, they've been brought in. We all have vulnerabilities. Everybody has a vulnerability that could be susceptible to being exploited, right? For them to say, I'm currently being trafficked. I had a vulnerability. It was highlighted and it was exploited. So I'm going to re-highlight my vulnerability by identifying as a victim and trust you not to exploit it by telling you that. Then I have to say, this person that I have love and care and attachment to maybe doesn't actually care about me, and I can't be out here on my own because somebody needs to care if I'm with a serial killer or somebody that's just going to do exactly what we agreed upon, and I need somebody to connect with. We are meant for community and relationship and attachment and all of these things, but there's no way that a person can say, I'm probably going to be strangled at least 4 times this week. I'm going to be addicted to some kind of substance to cope with all of this stuff. When I leave, even if somebody does identify me as a victim, I'm now going to have to get off substances. The court might say I'm not a victim, and then that gets really confusing. I'm going to say, okay, well, I had money and a roof over my head, and I knew how to survive this, and then I'm going to have to go into resources, which are great, but they're not what we typically think of, this new life on a golden platter for them, right? And this whole thing. And you don't have flashbacks of things you're actively surviving, right? So you're just surviving moment to moment to moment.
Day to day.
There's no way that your brain can say all of these things. I'm going to be seen. I'm not going to be seen as a victim. I'm not going to be received in the services. Typically, services have already failed me. I don't feel like anybody understands me. I'm probably going to die by the age of 34, only live for about 7 years in this. Even if I get services, about 70% of those victims go back to the life at some point. All of these things, and then walk into a hotel room and do your job. And that's just human behavior.
Yeah.
I asked the law enforcement that we talked to, could you do your job? If at the forefront of your brain you were thinking about the threat your life could be under when you walk up to a car on a traffic stop and you don't know what's in the car you pulled over.
Right.
When you make a decision in life or death, and whether it's the right decision or the wrong decision, that you, your family, everybody's going to be scrutinized. These individuals are in life or death situations multiple times a day.
It's just unbelievable. I'm just sitting here hearing you talk about the thoughts, the emotions, the psychological distress that someone is under. It just to hear it is almost overwhelming. It's almost too much for even me to take, because those are not neurotypical feelings that anybody should have to ever live through. And so I think when you say those things and you say it out loud, and you're trying to have someone understand what it's like to be living in this life, or the game that it's called many times, all of those things that you just said, when you think about it like that, I think it's then easier for people to understand that it's not easy to get out. You not only are you now, you're thinking, like you just said, well, I have to do this, and somebody's got to care for me, and if I leave, well, what about law enforcement? Who's going to believe me? Do I trust them? Do they trust me? There's that whole vicious cycle of just distrust and mistrust. And so I think that that's a misconception that most people think about. Well, why didn't they just leave? If they weren't locked up, if they weren't shackled somewhere in a dark basement, or God knows where, why didn't they just up and leave? Why didn't they just run? Why didn't they just flag the first car down that they saw? Why didn't they go, if they took their phone, why didn't they just go to a payphone? And so it's really important for people to hear what you're saying, and to hear how you become a victim, and more importantly, how the perpetrator, the predator, the animal, how they get control over you. And I've touched on that, in past episodes, but I want to hear from you. It doesn't have to be your own personal experience, but how does someone become that victim? How do they become psychologically imprisoned by one person?
It happens.
Or multiple people.
It happens very quickly and very, very easily. I mean, even those things that I was just saying, right? Those are not things that you're thinking about. You're not thinking, I'm going to be strangled 4 times. You're not thinking about the addiction. You're surviving. And surviving is so much easier than healing. We can talk about, kind of the after effects in a little bit of what that looks like when you have to kind of recognize you're a victim and go through that. That disclosure is almost like a divorce. It's a huge cognitive dissonance. It's a grief process to realize you are vulnerable, and then to have to still be in the world and feel that vulnerability is really hard. Yeah. But I think that the control piece happens so quickly. So there are many different people that can be traffickers, right? It doesn't matter. It can be a family member. It can be a husband or a spouse. It can be a friend. It can be gang facilitated. There's all different kinds of trafficking that we see. And every single person has a vulnerability. There are definitely vulnerabilities of those that are in the foster care system, or those that are struggling with identity and don't feel seen or supported. Basic attachment theory tells us that we are always asking 2 questions. Do I have a voice, and is that voice heard? And that's what builds relationships. So many times, if people feel like they don't have a voice in the situation that they're in, or they don't feel heard, and that can be all of us that feel that at times, right?
Absolutely.
We seek out attachment. Traffickers are excellent chameleons. They will shapeshift to whatever you need. So if you, let's say you are, you're at a boarding school and your parents have tons of money and you go on yachts and you do all these things, right? But you don't feel like you have a very close relationship with them, or you don't feel like you can meet their expectations. He can shapeshift to be validation and love. Let's say you don't have money to go on your band trip and whatever else you want to do, and he can be like, you know what, you're so good at that instrument. I'm just going to invest in this. Let's do this. You could say, we talk about online behavior, right, and the normalization of OnlyFans and the things that we're seeing in our culture and with kids younger and younger. But online behavior, just seeking connection, can be as simple as, I had a fight with my mom. Right. And a trafficker can come in and say, man, but you're so smart and you're so articulate and you're so good at all this, right? Like, let's just chat. And there's just small ways of breaking down communication and breaking down barriers where you become reliant. I also think a huge vulnerability that I see, probably the biggest one that I see, is a history of sexual abuse or exploitation. Yeah. At some point, the body becomes transactional, and I cannot tell you how many times I've heard somebody say, and you'll hear me say girl or female, but we also know male, non-binary, anybody can be trafficked or the trafficker. But I've had so many girls say to me, well, it's going to be taken from me anyway. Why would I give it for free? At least I make money, right? Yep. And this whole thing, and I get that.
Trying to validate it.
Yeah. Yeah, that takes some control, right? And when we experience trauma, just to define that, right? I define trauma as anything outside of your external or internal coping skills. We do what they call subconsciously reenacting the trauma to gain mastery. So that looks like you are drawn to the same relationship dynamics over and over. You marry somebody just like a parent you have a not totally healthy relationship with. You get into a helping profession to prevent what happened to you from happening to others, right? You decide to become a therapist because you probably want a therapist, right? You try to be that thing. That can all be trauma reenactment. It's not bad. But if you've been exploited or sexually abused as a kid, your brain may naturally be drawn to that life or to those things because your brain is doing what the brain is designed to do to feel some sense of control. And I think the control piece is where we come in and where the traffickers are very good at helping you feel like you're actually in control and you guys are a partnership.
Exactly.
Right?
The partnership.
The partnership. And it becomes you guys against the sex buyers, you guys against the police that don't know anything, you guys against the other girls and the other traffickers. And that bond becomes really, really quick because we need somebody.
Yeah, and so what you're saying right now is what I'm constantly trying to teach people, is the relationship is not, like you said, is chameleon. So it's a wolf in, sheep's clothes. They will be anything that you want them to be. So if you need a friend, if you are looking for a romantic partner, if you're just looking for someone to accept your sexuality or your gender identification, whatever it is, they're going to be that for you, and then you're sucked in. And so I think it's especially important for parents to know those different, vulnerabilities, the online stuff. Just someone, like you said, that can come from, you could be born with a silver spoon in your mouth, and you might be lacking just a warm, safe relationship with, it should be your parents, but if it's not, just with someone that you can go and just talk to about what you're experiencing in life. And then you go to online and you go to the predator's paradise. It's right there. It's so easy. All you got to do is open up your laptop or your phone or whatever, and they're there and they are waiting for you. They're waiting for your children. And I think that once people realize that it can happen to anyone, because like you said in the very beginning, we all have vulnerabilities. I think that we're more likely to know what to look out for, and then start to try and understand how that relationship can start to develop between two people. Like you said, all of a sudden now it's like, me and you against the world. So not only is it me and you, we're in a partnership now, you've got my back, I've got your back, and we're making money, and I'm gonna be able to buy this, and we're gonna be able to go here. And the next thing you know, these people look like they're living the life with a silver spoon, and they're driving the nicest cars and wearing the nicest clothes, and buying anything that they want, and the nice handbags and things like that. But that's just a facade.
Right.
And what's happening behind closed doors can be just absolutely just too much to even think about.
Right. I think both in the hurting and the healing, it's all about relationship, right? Trauma happens in relationships, so healing has to happen in relationship. And a lot of people say that actually more impactful than the trauma itself is the lack of an empathetic witness once you're trying to process it.
That's good.
There's been so many studies that talk about this. And so, yes, the experience itself is really traumatic and you survive the experience. And when nobody's there to kind of receive you and do all of that. And on the services side, when we talk about that, that's really the big issue I think that we have is we have a very rescue mentality culture of these are very vulnerable victims that were duped and they want help and they want all of these things, and I'm going to come in and I'm going to rescue them. And I like to say that rescue ends in the sound of you because it's usually about you.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing, right? But usually it's, man, trafficking is so overwhelming and you don't want to feel helpless. Or you're worried about somebody and you don't want to worry about them at night or if they're okay or not. Or you, you are trying to work out your own stuff or just feel some sense of control, right, to function in the world. And so it's a more survivable belief to say, like, I can rescue this person, I can fix them. The hardest part of my job as an advocate is that I cannot save somebody from their own brain.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, so
I
true.
can't rescue somebody. I would say even in my own experience, there's probably about 10 people that would say, I rescued Meghan Connors because they changed my location, right? And really they made things worse because I was now more vulnerable and I didn't need to be rescued. I needed to be received, right? Receiving is partnership. It's not another pressure of, tell me you're traffickers or you're going to jail, or a power dynamic of, I have resources for you, but you need to comply and heal in the way that I think you should and not ever relapse and not ever struggle or not ever want to go back to what you know, right? Which we all want what we know.
Yeah.
It's the platitudes of you poor, helpless victim and I'm so privileged and I can just do everything for you. That doesn't actually feel good, right? These victims and survivors of trafficking are the most resilient, resourceful people you will ever meet in your life.
Heck yeah.
They have to be.
Absolutely.
They have to be. And they do it, and they do it so, so well. But we have to do that partnership of receiving them and walking alongside them because otherwise we just kind of re-exploit their exploitation.
Yes.
And I felt so many times in my own exit journey that it was people were willing to risk my safety for evidence, to risk my safety for want me to be a certain person or not have the feelings I had or not be able to be honest about things or not struggle to make sure that they felt like their investment was good and
that they were checking their box off.
Yeah, and it felt like, okay, so you're no different than a pimp and why would I want you over the one that I know, right? There's also a ton of dynamics that we see when you're in that exit strategy of when you're not in external chaos anymore, that internal chaos gets really, really loud. So I would much rather be in external chaos than internal chaos. The having to come to terms with the relationship, the having to come to terms with we're all walking vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah.
And it's either going to be seen or exploited. And instead of being seen and received, you ended up in this exploitive situation. Now nobody understands like you and your trafficker understand each other. Then somebody comes along and says, oh, you were victimized. And you have to kind of thaw out enough and get safe enough to go through that process of was I naive? But I thought he loved me, but this is okay. And maybe I've got a criminal record and maybe I've got some substances now and maybe I don't have a place to stay and maybe I don't want to go to a faith-based organization or maybe I'm afraid to give up my phone or maybe whatever it is, right? And it's just, it's so much harder.
You know, there's just so many thoughts going through my mind right now, you know, when you're saying all these different things. But the one thing that I want to say is that you are so correct when you say that it is about receiving, whether you are law enforcement, when you're the medical field, you're an advocate. I personally, you know, I work with these people and you cannot teach compassion. And you cannot teach empathy. And in a perfect world, everybody that was involved in this would receive these victims of trafficking in a different, in a more positive way. And as resilient and tough as a victim can be, I have learned that it is such an intricate and delicate way that you have to receive these individuals.
Yeah.
Not because they're fragile. That's not what I mean. But if you want to truly receive them and you want to truly rescue them and get them, you know, on the road to restoration and healing, I've learned that, like I said, I mean, it can be tricky and you've got to know what you're doing. And that is why it is so important for, you know, us advocates, you educators and advocate. It's so important. It's vital in this field to know what you're doing. And like I said, unfortunately, we can't teach compassion. And that's what we need. And I mean, you can fake it, and you can learn how to ask the right questions and learn how to not ask the wrong questions, which I think is part of the biggest problem. Like you and I had talked about earlier before, we were recording. You have to really make sure that you're not putting them, in the defensive. They're already doing that. So if you're wanting to know what is going on and you're wanting to learn what they're experiencing and what is happening, boy, oh boy, it's definitely not your average, cops and robbers, why'd you do this? It's not going to work like that.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things as an advocate is, getting away from that idea of they should be so thankful that they have a better life now. They should be so thankful that now they have these opportunities and all these things. Like when you're actually working in this field, you see all of the gaps and the barriers and how hard it is to get services and the ways that services can support and sometimes harm and all of the things that happen and almost take control away from a person as they're in their own process. But I think that ultimately it really comes down to that big fear that I hear, right? People who want to do advocacy, but they're afraid they're going to say something wrong. And so I want to make sure that we say that, like, I say things wrong all the time. I do all the time. And I'll be like, I go back to that attachment of, do I have a voice? Is that voice heard? So I'll be like, man, that was real dumb. Clearly didn't do that great, did I? Tell me what I can do better next time. Does she have a voice? Is that voice heard, right? All the things. And I would rather you have a relationship to rupture than to have no relationship to even have anything to repair at all, right? People are humans and they make mistakes, and being honest about my own mistakes with boundaries. I'm very boundaried in what I share. I don't reveal that I'm a survivor unless it's relevant because it's not about me. I don't play the trauma Olympics. I don't get a gold medal, right? I'm not going to share enough where they are worried if they're going to trigger me, or they're comparing stories, or they're worried, if I'm too tired, or none of those things. She should not have to be responsible for me because I refuse to be, right? Like I'm responsible for me, but I'll be a little honest that I know a little bit more about the game than normal, right? And we have some conversations, but I think ultimately it goes back to that. You're gonna say stuff. You're gonna make mistakes. You're going to have all of that. And I think being allowed to be a human with your own and being honest about your limitations and all of those things kind of allows them to be humans. And it goes back to ultimately, like, you are a product and not a person. Every relationship you have is transactional. And even in kind of the initial services historically, before we started getting sales-based training, right, it is transactional. It is give me the worst experiences of your life in a form that I can understand how that happened, and I feel like you're a victim enough that I'm going to try to provide you services and safety and all of those things. It is hey, you can stay on my couch, but you can't stay on my couch for free with a trafficker. It is everything is transactional.
Victim enough is what you just said.
Yeah. And everything is transactional.
How can you be enough of a victim? I mean, what do they want?
Right.
Right. And when you say things like that, it just,
right.
Man, it's
and
just,
that's where we go with the trauma Olympics of who is a worthy victim. And then on the other side, something that I see, because I also get to do some long-term mentorship with survivors, is who is too healed to qualify for assistance. I have numerous survivors that I'm working with right now that it is a matter of $50 to $70 or less for them to meet a need, right? And there's nowhere that they can go to get that need met. And let's say they, I don't know, do Uber or DoorDash or something, right? And they're waiting for a housing voucher and they're trying to serve all these resources, but they can't pay their phone bill that's needed for that. Where does a survivor who's been out for 3, 4, 5 years but is still waiting on these resources, because it takes a long time. I mean, the last time I tried to leave, it took 2.5 years, being homeless in my car, falling through gaps to get any kind of safety. It takes a long time for these services, and they're very limited in how they can be handed out. And so who do they go to, right? Because they don't qualify. Or
Right.
even victims who have picked up charges that are misdemeanors from the trauma of dealing with the trafficking, not the trafficking itself, and they don't qualify for public representation because it's a misdemeanor. And, you know, they go to the nonprofits who do amazing work, but technically the charge wasn't from while they were being trafficked.
Exactly.
And I mean, I'm having people asking me, you know, Meghan, do I post a sex ad and go back out so I can make the money to continue in my healing? Or if I catch a case or I get arrested, then am I a victim enough to qualify for help? And that's one of the hardest parts of my job is, you know, I personally cannot meet the $50 to $70 for everybody every time, but I do my best to gather those resources because nobody should have to give you nobody should have to give you their pain and their story for your help. And at the same time, like, you're not too healed. I think you get more and more healed. Healed.
It sounds almost like a game of survival of the fittest.
It is, absolutely.
You get out of the game, or you're trying to get out of the game. You're trying to find out how you're going to be helped, how you're going to survive. Then you slowly but surely start to find out, like you said, I'm not victim enough, so do I just go back to the game? How about just one ad? How about just one escort? How about just one trick?
You just got to pay the electric bill. Just got to do this. And the traffickers start with that most of the time. Most of the time, the traffickers say this is temporary. It's, oh, baby, it's just until we get a white picket fence and a golden retriever, and you're my favorite, and we're going to get married, and we're going to do all these things. It's just till we pay off these bills. It's just until we get these student loan debt. It's just. And then most of the time when people go back out, it's because it's just, or because they start to feel safe and they feel like they're missing something, right? That external chaos versus internal chaos. And so that I would rather be surviving than to, like I say, like kind of be thawed out, right? And even to be seen, to be received by somebody is really uncomfortable when you've been treated like a product and not a person. To have that humanity validated and restored and consistent, not based on what you do or don't do and how you do it, is a little bit disarming, but it's nice. Even if they don't tell you, they might be really gruff to you, right? And then they're going to go back and be like, that person was so kind. I did that to so many people.
Yeah.
And it's just that, I mean, it's so easy to go back, right? It's so easy to go back to what we know. And our brains create these kind of neural pathways, right? They're like ruts in a road. You do the same things over and over, these patterns. We all are more comfortable with what we know than what we don't. And I think that a lot of the behaviors that we see from survivors that don't make sense, whether they're still in the game, they're initially exiting, or sometimes in the longer term life process. If I always say, if it's maladaptive when you're in safety, the behavior was adaptive in danger. Everything we do serves us in some way. So let's say somebody calls a program and says, hey, I need diapers for my child, right? And they give diapers and they do a great thing. And then they call another program and they say, hey, I have no diapers for my child. I need this. And then they call a third one, right? And then the programs are like, man, this person is hoarding resources and they're just so manipulative. Are they manipulative, or are they still living out of a scarcity mindset because they feel like it's transactional and your compassion ends after you feel good about the good deed? Right? We see these things happen all the time, the behaviors that don't necessarily make sense. And I, as an advocate, don't get to come in and say, you no longer get to use this behavior that emotionally or physically, psychologically kept you safe. I get to come in and say, hey, I'm not actively in trauma right now. We've got a bit of rapport and relationship. I'm not sure what's going on here. Like, maybe what are we communicating? What's the function? And what part of that do you feel safe enough to let go of for now? What part do you want to hold on to? I expect every person I work with to lie to me. I'm always like, I tell them, I'm like, if at any point you lie to me and then you want to tell me later, like, hey girl, that wasn't quite accurate. Okay. Right? It's surviving. They're expert survivalists. And I consistently say this to the people I get the privilege of walking with, that I am so, so thankful for their resilience and also so sorry that they've had to be.
Yes. Amen to that. Okay, so before we wrap up this episode, because we're going to do a 2-part series with Meghan Connors here, so you're going to have to come back next week and listen to the second part. But my question before we leave today is, how long have you been walking free of the game?
Well, I think walking free of the game, it can have its own definitions. I would still say there's still times in my life that I'm probably the most emotionally healthy, vulnerable, emotionally connected that I've ever been in my life, where I would love to do some really deep healing work, but finding access to that kind of intensive trauma therapy. I think it's a long-term process. It has only actually been, I tried to leave the last major time in 2018, and then it took until about 2021 to get any kind of safety. So now we're in 2024. So I still call my 2018, 2019 dates, but it's a process, and it's a constant process of unlearning. And I think the way that my brain works, which we can't control, right, has really helped me to be able to kind of compartmentalize and handle things in a way that's been really helpful.
Yeah. And so for people that are listening and are not watching this audio show, podcast, I just want to tell you that Meghan is sitting across from me, and despite what you might think from the movies that you've watched or the news or whatever, I'm sitting in front of this absolutely beautiful girl that is so articulate. She's so smart. You would never in a million years know by looking at her or talking to her that she is a survivor. And so I just want to make sure that people remember that, that it can be anyone. It could be your sister. It could be your mother. It could be your aunt. It could be your cousin. It could be anyone. And so I just want to make sure that people remember that this does not discriminate. And so just sitting here talking to you, it's just such a joy, because you're just so articulate, so much. I could sit here, all day and talk to you, which we are pretty much. But is there anything else just in regards to, I guess, because we're going to get into talking about the loops and the gaps in our system, but is there anything that you want to, any major point that you want to make to people just about victims or how someone can control someone?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we're going to talk about kind of some of the control dynamics and then some of the gaps and how those play out when you're trying to leave, why it's so difficult. But I think it really is just kind of what you said of, we all have trauma. We all have things, right? And I always say it's not the trauma Olympics. I don't get a gold medal. Of course, trafficking, I do have a different level, right? And when we use terms like safe, like what does safe mean to me versus your experience of safe are different things, right? We have a lot of language barriers, but you really don't know what somebody is going through. And maybe they psychologically can't even really know, put a definition or put verbiage to at the time. And in my exit journey, the moments that I can still recall that I felt the most compassion were not from frontline workers. They were from people who were just in there every day doing their job, that saw me as a person and just showed up just a little bit with what they had. I think so many people are like, well, I'm not a police officer, and I'm not an advocate, and I'm not a social worker, and I'm not a trauma therapist. So this is not my lane, but I do care, right? To be trauma informed only means that you're willing to look at people's behavior and the way that people are doing things with the lens that maybe trauma is involved. That maybe life is really hard, and that they're doing the best that they can. That's all it takes. And so it will never be a bad thing to just be validating the humanity in each other. Yeah, and that's perfect, because here we say, if you see something, say something, please. It could be a matter of life or death. The worst thing that could happen is that you could be wrong. And actually, that's not the worst thing that could happen. That'd be the best case scenario, is that you are wrong. So it doesn't hurt to make that call or to have that conversation with the right person. And so it's just absolutely necessary for you to do that. And like you said, it just takes just a person that cares. You don't have to be a professional in this field. You don't have to be an advocate or law enforcement or any of those things. Just be a person that cares enough to make that phone call. And if you or anyone that you know, if you even suspect it, call 911 or
for resources, you can call the Human Trafficking Hotline, and they will get you the resources that you need. And that number is 1-888-373-7888. So remember, if you see something, say something, and please stay smart and stay safe, and we'll see you next time.